Well, welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the habits, mindset, and behaviors that elevate our capacity to lead. I'm your host, Charles Good, and today we're diving in deep into one of the most overlooked topics for leadership development: the ability to read other people. Our guest is Joe Navarro, a name synonymous with expertise in nonverbal communication. He's a former FBI agent who has spent the last 2.5 decades specializing in counterintelligence and behavioral assessments. His best-selling book, What Every Body is Saying, has been translated into multiple languages and is considered essential reading for anyone who leads, negotiates, sells, interviews, or just interacts with humans. Joe's insights aren't about tricks or gimmicks. They're grounded in psychology, neuroscience, and decades of real-world experience. So today, he's going to teach us how to lead with more presence and spot discomfort before it becomes disengagement, along with helping us to connect more deeply with our peers without saying a word. So stick around, because once you learn how to read these signals others miss, everything about how you lead is going to change. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Through candid conversations and expert perspectives, we dive into the challenges, breakthroughs, and practical lessons that shape exceptional leadership. Well, let's start at the beginning with not with the FBI, but with curiosity. What sparked your interest in nonverbal communication? And was there a defining moment that led you down the path?
Thanks for the question. I'd like to say, well, it was one specific thing. I remember as a child just being very curious and watching people in Miami queue up to get on the bus. I guess I was a weird kid, maybe nerdy, because I was thinking, well, how do they know how far to stand from the other person? And then I think I've written about the time I looked up and all these birds were perfectly equidistant on an electric line. And I'm thinking, God, that looks almost like a ruler. They're so perfectly, how do they know? And I've asked my mother about this, and she said, "No, you were just, you were always asking questions." So I think my interest in body language started very young, maybe 9 or 10 years old, but I was always captivated by its authenticity, where, sometimes people would say things, but their body language, maybe it revealed other things. So I think there was a lot of that. Certainly by the time I was, 1971 when I started college, I just loved anthropology and I loved the study of different cultures and how everybody, acted different. So I wish there was one single event, but I don't think so.
And you went on to spend over 2.5 decades with the FBI, specializing in counterintelligence and behavioral assessment. How did that experience really shape your view on human behavior, not just in high stakes interrogations, but in everyday life?
Well, the one thing you learn, as soon as you enter law enforcement is that you're really a paid observer, and how well you observe really determines how good you are in law enforcement. Even before I entered into the FBI, I was at Brigham Young University, and I'd gone through the Utah Police Academy, and there were some people there that were really good police officers. And what I noticed them is when they were on patrol, they would see things that at first I didn't notice. Something like the amount of dirt or leaves that were in front of a car, the tire of a car, and maybe the car was abandoned and things like that. And I learned to just observe with greater precision. And certainly in the FBI, especially in the area of counterintelligence, which is where I spent most of my time, basically spy catching. Charlie, if you're a spy, you don't walk around saying, "Hey, I'm a spy, catch me." These are people who are trained to hide and conceal their activities and do so professionally. So how we detect them to a great extent is really based on our ability to observe even the most subtle of behaviors, for instance, how fast they walk on a regular day versus when they're operational. How often do they look at their watch or at their phone to see what time it is? And little things that you wouldn't see it as being suspicious, but begins to tell you something about someone who may be up to committing espionage.
Well, and your book really has become a staple across many industries, from law enforcement to leadership. How has your understanding of body language evolved since that first book on what everybody is saying first came out? And are there any insights you've gained recently that you wish had included in that book?
Oh, wow. I don't think anybody's asked me that, and I wish other people had. So, congratulations. That's a profound question. A lot of what I wrote about and what everybody is saying was written in 2007, but a lot of what I had learned over the years was older than that. So, for instance, when I was sort of being educated in the area of nonverbals and so forth, which was formally in the 1990s, I was studying under people like Paul Ekman, Mark Frank, Bella DeParlo, Judy Burgoon, all these great researchers. At that time, and from other people, we often referred to the limbic system of the brain and so forth. And since that, science has grown away from that. So now we talk more about just the brain and itself rather than referring to the limbic system and so forth. And so, science continues, things are more advanced, but some things still stand out that in a way, I was shocked that nobody had written about, for instance, covering of the suprasternal notch, which is this little area right here, and how little effort has been done to do further research into the area. The other thing that sort of surprised me was how many people started using it that come from the field of medicine, where it has been used in dealing with patients, in reading patients, in understanding patients. A lot of times doctors ask questions, and maybe the patient is reluctant to answer for a variety of reasons. And through body language, they're able to help with that. And of late is an inordinate amount of people that have written to me and said, I use it to help my child, which, is on the, autism spectrum, to help them look for certain behaviors to help them out. Really, these 2 areas were totally unexpected to me that they would find, such interest. And then of late, in the area of negotiations, where I think people are finally realizing that a lot of negotiation has to do with the nonverbal aspect of it. So, for instance, where are we having the meeting? How many people are going to attend? What time of day? Who's going to sit where? Who's going to enter first? If you come in with a team, where are you going to be looking as somebody on your team is talking? And all these very subtle things that contribute to successful negotiations, that's become an important area.
Well, thanks for providing those insights. And you've often said that body language starts with observation, which I agree. But let's be honest, most of us are not trained observers. So, what separates a casual observer from someone that is truly skilled at decoding nonverbal behavior?
Well, let's define things. So I define nonverbals as everything that communicates but isn't a word. So I look at you and say, well, you don't wear glasses. I do. So you can infer certain things from that. You can look at the background of my office as I look at the background of your office, and I could probably say, I think he likes baseball. Just So there are things that are communicating about us from the things that we attach to ourselves. And at the same time, as we go through life, I guess the best example is, maybe your father or mother said, when you cross the street, look. Okay. So that looking is not observing. What I tell people is the difference between looking and observing is, oh, there's a car coming. Observing is there's a Mazda and there's 4 people on board and it's coming at approximately 40 miles an hour, and the driver is distracted, because for whatever the reason, he's looking at his phone as he's driving. Oh, and by the way, it's a 25 mile per hour, speed limit, and it looks like everybody inside that car is just laughing at the moment for whatever the reason. That's an observation. It's being able to see with greater detail in the same way that when you want go to a specialist, you may go to a dentist who immediately can say, "Oh, you haven't been flossing. You need to floss." How do you know that? Well, that's what I do for a living. And specialties, right? I mean, I've put together boxes, hammered them together, and I've had carpenters say, "Did you do this?" And I go, "Yeah." Is that not very well. So, specialties, people who have played, sports, who know how to perform, certain things will pick up on those, little things. And what it teaches us is that we can all improve our ability to observe. And the question is, where do we devote that time? How well we do it? Some people are obviously better at it. And do we validate those observations? Because as I teach, one thing is for me to tell you, Charlie, if your guest compresses their lips, they might be reticent, they may experience discomfort or whatever. But until you go out and really validate that on your own and see it 30, 40, 50 times, you're still going to have to think about it. And so the good observers just learn to validate things and say, "Yeah, I saw that behavior. I don't have to think about it. I'm confident with it."
So it's being more consciously aware to strengthen that muscle and spending time deliberately focusing on certain things instead of just going on autopilot so often, right? That we do throughout the day when we're observing people and in meetings or situations, it's being more cognizant of it.
It's that, but it's going further because rather than waiting for those occasions, you're constantly doing it. So your brain is very plastic. We now know that the brain will continue to expand and grow depending on how much information we continue to feed it. We can even, it's called myelination. We can myelinate, strengthen the connections so that they're more robust and they're faster. So you can pick up things more quickly. But like anything else, you have to constantly be observing. So it's a matter of taking it to a higher level to where you really don't allow yourself to not observe, but you're building on those observations. So as you're looking at a movie, let's say it's from a foreign country. I love to watch movies from foreign countries, and usually I watch them without the sound on. I'm picking up the behaviors and saying, okay, this is the protagonist, this is the antagonist. These people love each other. This is the mother-in-law that doesn't like, and so non-verbally, you're picking up things so much faster that, in relationships or in business, it gives you such an advantage that you're really, ahead of the curve.
I love that technique, just turning down the sound or watching a film in a foreign language and just looking for the body language cues and being more deliberate with that. Because you're right, many people are not trained on that. I mean, I think there's certain professions, right, that really kind of focus you in on those traits, like law enforcement, but not too many do. So let's move now to the body language and let's start from the ground up. I've heard this a lot that the most honest part of your body is your feet. Why is that so revealing? And when it comes to decoding body language, such as emotion or intent?
Yeah, people were sort of shocked when I wrote what everybody's saying and saying, "Well, most people start with the face. Why did you start with the feet?" And my observation was it's the one area we least look at, and yet it tends to be the most authentic because in essence, our feet are responsible, yes, for our mobility, but they're also responsible for our safety. And if you've ever noticed, if you're in a very in a precipice, let's say you're on a mountain, nobody runs to the edge of that mountain to look over. You walk very softly and gently an inch forward. And that is your brain saying, I will not permit the feet to do anything that jeopardizes your survival. And so the behaviors that we often see with the feet, which I saw, thousands of times in my interviews, reveal that when people are being very cautious, the feet behave in a certain way. When you see someone that you recognize, maybe you don't like them, and you'll look at them, but your feet will remain oriented away from that person. And, in my book, The Dictionary of Body Language, I talk about that's called ventral denial, where your feet orient you so that your ventral side, your chest and belly side, is not exposed to someone that is a threat or you dislike. The authenticity of that I have demonstrated or I have seen all over the world. And so it's one of those behaviors that is very universal. And you often see it very early on with children who will look at someone that calls their name, but because they're not trusting of that person, they orient away. So I wanted to put it first and foremost in my book and say, just think about how much information you're missing from foot behavior. How often, for instance, people who like each other, they may sit at a cafe and not say a word. And on the surface, you think, oh, they're not getting along, and yet their feet are right next to each other. There is no way a couple will allow their feet to be close or even to touch if they don't really feel very positive about each other. And so it's a good way to make observations that are very authentic, but it's in an area that we don't often focus on because most people prefer to focus on the face.
Oh, you're right, and I've seen that a lot when someone comes into your office and their feet are pointing toward the door, means they wanna leave. If they're in a group, you can kinda look at the feet to see who the leader is, and they usually have their feet pointed toward that authoritative person and or the person, like you said, they like. I also like what you say about, those gravity-defying behaviors, right, that we elicit when we're excited about something. So,
Yeah.
rocking up and down on the balls of your feet, walking with a bounce in your step, or even a person growing taller to emphasize certain points. Those are things to look at and cue in on to identify what their emotional state is and if they're really believe what they're saying.
Back in the day, we used to post scores, class tests on a board, and you could tell who got a great score just by the bounce in their step after they would read their student number and they'd say A plus. They'd walk out of there with a bounce in their step, and the guys that got a C or a D, well, yeah, they would drag out. So it's a useful area of the body that has a lot of information, often neglected, but yeah, very very useful.
Well, and even like what you were saying too in your books is that look at look for a different behavior. So if a person's feet are bouncing and then also all of a sudden they have a foot freeze is unsettling to them in some way. But I've also looked at it in terms of like that foot lock and lead when they don't feel secure or they're insecure about what they're saying, their feet kind of come up underneath them and they cross their feet together.
Yeah, well, sometimes you're just sitting next to them, and all of a sudden, they're inevitably happens. I've sat next to students and I said, "Well, I'm gonna do a pop quiz," and all of a sudden their ankles intertwine around the legs of the chair. It's like, "What?" It's like, hang on. For instance, with poker players, a lot of times they'll look at their cards and things will change. Maybe the community cards change and they realize, "Oh my god, I've got the so-called, nuts. I've got the winning hand." And their feet literally, and not figuratively, begin to bounce and their shirts are moving, and it's because they literally have happy feet. Just like when you tell children, "Hey, we're going to Disney," and they're bouncing up and down, and it manifests their true, emotions. So there's a lot to learn there if you know what you're looking for, sure.
And the other thing that I wanted to mention to you to see if there's any accuracy with it is that when people are sitting side by side one another and they cross their one leg over the other, what I've been told is the knee that they're, the top knee, where it's pointing is the person they prefer. So if they have people on both the left and the right, you can kind of get some indication of who they feel more comfortable with.
I have been in situations where, probably more importantly, where would they end up leaning? So anytime you lean towards somebody, it's probably a more, comfortable, or they're getting along, better. I myself, because I've had injuries to my legs over the years, I constantly have to shift, right over left, left over right as I'm sitting because of pain and so forth. So I wouldn't draw too much inference from that. Like anything else, you want to look at the totality of it. So I look for the mirroring of behaviors, the what's called isopraxis. And that is, if you sit back and relax and I sit back and relax, if we're talking in the same tone of voice, you reach for something to drink and then, maybe I reach, this synchrony of behaviors is indicative of harmony. And that's very powerful. So when we study people, I used to walk along Collins Avenue in Miami Beach, and there used to be a lot of elderly people there in the '60s, many of them from, New York and New Jersey, and I would watch how they would sit and they would talk, and the synchrony of it all was, to me, was very educational, how as they got along, and then when somebody said, "Okay, it's time to get up," then, the whole group would get up. So I look for synchrony as a form of harmony. Now, what is interesting, and it's anecdotal, it hasn't been proven, but I've seen it so many times, is when people are standing, and let's say you have a mother or a father and you've got 2 daughters and you've got one on either side. Watch how they cross, the man in the middle or the mother in the middle crosses her legs. And one of the things that I found, and it's just anecdotal, but I've seen it too many times, that we tend to cross the legs while we're standing so that we're off balance. But if we were to fall, we would fall towards the favored child. Now, you can imagine the mayhem you could do that at a family get together, but I've seen it at gatherings, and so when without revealing too much, I'll say to the sisters or to the brothers, "Okay, who's mom's favorite?" And I've seen it enough to where I feel satisfied that it's fairly accurate, but obviously it's not very scientific. But it's an interesting thing because when we cross our legs, it's a high comfort display and we're actually off balance. And the brain wouldn't allow us to be off balance if we really weren't comfortable. But then who would we fall towards? And so
Well, yeah, and I just want to reiterate what you said about mirroring, so important, and trying to establish a baseline behavior to differentiate the normal from the stress. You're always watching for multiple tells, behaviors that occur in clusters or succession, because otherwise it's just could be a one-off. They could have, I mean, if they're crossing their arms, they could be cold, not disengaged, but there's ways to get them to uncross their arms. So multiple tells, be a competent observer of the environment is so critical.
Let me say this about baseline behaviors because, in a way, I hesitated to put that in my book because so much has been made of it. Anytime you are in the presence of somebody else, you're actually affecting the experiment, right? So if you and I were in the same room or even in a virtual environment, I'm affecting you and you're affecting me. So to obtain true baselines, if you want true baselines, get a nanny cam, hide it, and videotape, and then you're gonna get baseline behaviors. What most of us say is, "Well, I'm looking for baselines." We're really not. What we're looking at is what's called idiosyncratic behaviors. So, some people might say, "Well, Joe touches his chin a lot or touches his nose a lot," well, especially during allergy season here with the oaks. And so what we're looking at is idiosyncratic behaviors. Now, what I tell students of nonverbals is what we want to look for is what is the stimulus that causes changes. So if all of a sudden you ask me a question that maybe I don't like, and I go from touching my face to scratching my face, whoa, it's like, okay, Joe didn't like that or I stiffen my neck. So we look for, is there a stimulus that then causes a change in behavior? And that is actually more meaningful than the variety of behaviors that I might have, which I use to self-soothe or calm myself down and things like that. So, because I know you're deeply interested in this, so I differentiate between baselines, which you really can only observe when there is no one present, and idiosyncratic, which is what most people focus on.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.